This story comes from the pages of Marvel Hell Hunters, issue number 3. Please support the official release. The next issue begins, where we see the transformed Brookner and his demon Nazi brethren as they descend from the skies, noting that they needed to rid themselves of the Ghost Rider and the Sorcerer who dared threaten their plans. Making their way to the snowy grounds, the soldiers came across a band of fellow Nazis, whose tank was currently stuck. Ominously emerging through the winter storm, the men approached the troop's colonel, whom we discover was named Schmidt. Schmidt would wonder just who these dudes were and why they weren't wearing a coat, where Brookner would soon identify himself, where the colonel would tell the man he knew he was coming and was to give he and his men any resource they needed. However, given that their 40-ton death machine was stuck in the snow, Schmidt told Brookner that they barely had any supplies for themselves, and that the roads were essentially impassable. Brookner would then warmly comfort the man, telling him not to sell himself short, and that he still had something of utmost value, and that was his men. In the very next panel, we'd see Brookner's soldiers turn into their monstrous ice demon forms, where they tear into the troopers' flesh, infecting them with their hellish disease. In complete shock of what he just witnessed, poor Schmidt would not even have time to process things, where he soon felt Brookner's darkened claw slice right into his neck. As Schmidt lay dying, he was met by the hellish grin of the madman, who now addressed him by the name of Raphael, and that it was time to accept their gift, and that the hallowed had need of him once more. Things are then taken to Camp 20 in France, where we'd see the station troopers rather uptight to see an uninvited party arrive to the scene. Their worries would quickly be put to rest though, as we discover this was Nick Fury and the Howling Commandos, who oh so politely pulled rank by telling the troops that he'd personally kick their butts if they did not let him through. A voice would come from behind the men telling Fury to go easy on the boys, for after all they were just doing their jobs. This voice would come from Captain America of all people, who just so happened to currently be stationed at this camp as well. We'd see that this era Steve Rogers was already quite friendly with Agent Carter and even knew Wolverine. Man, this could have been so cool seeing this in the movies. Imagine in the first Captain America, or even in X-Men Origins Wolverine, we got to see Cap and Logan just taking down Nazis together. It would have been crazy. People will say it was because of legal reasons they couldn't do it, but we all know why. It would have been too much handsome all at once. We just couldn't handle it. Meeting inside the general's tent, the team was asked just what was going on with the bizarre occurrences during the war. From planes going down in areas where there was no artillery, to Omaha Beach being completely frozen in June. Something was not right. The team, knowing that Brookner and his men were behind this, relayed just who they were and where we finally got a much desired origin on just what they were. Here we discover that Brookner and his men were possessed by spirits called the unhallowed, which surprisingly were created by a human. This was a 16th century woman who went by the name of Alexandra Nightbringer, who had fallen madly in love. However, this was not just with any man. Alexandra had fallen in love with the devil himself. After offering nearly her entire village's worth of livestock, and even some of their own children as sacrifice to the Dark Lord, Alexandra's fellow man had finally had enough, where they burnt the woman alive at the stake, with the spawn of Satan supposedly in her belly. However, this pregnancy was no mere rumor, for as the flames died down, we'd see the burnt, bloodied corpse of Nightbringer and a young child on the snowy ground where she'd make her sacrifices. This tainted mystic blood would then seep into the earth, where it would give life to horrendous, monstrous creatures called the unhallowed, demented elementals that plagued that part of Europe for quite some time, and they were now possessing the bodies of some of the most powerful military members on the planet. As the sorcerer soldier Sebastian Zardos gave his creepy Marvel demon lore breakdown to the general, we'd see the current Ghost Rider Sal Romero waiting outside. As the other soldiers would catch up on some much needed rest, Sal would begin to hear what sounded like crying. Investigating the sound, Romero would discover that this was a child's cry. And this wasn't just any child, this was a young World War II era Bucky Barnes, decades before he would become the infamous Winter Soldier. We'd see just why he was crying too. Despite being a kid, this Bucky still had quite the taste for violence like his adult counterpart, for he was sad that all the Nazi ears he had taken from his victims were taken away. Yeah, you heard that right. This kid was only like 15 years old and had been racking up countless kills where he'd then cut off their ears and keep them as trophies. Yeah, dude, I don't think it was all the Hydra brainwashing that made you nuts. Sure, it didn't help, but there were definitely some screws loose prior to that, it seems. Things would then be taken back inside the general's tent, where in typical horror movie fashion, the guy would not believe them about the unhallowed, believing this to be a bunch of Sunday school fear-mongering nonsense, and certainly could not report this back to President Eisenhower. What he did know though was that Hitler was trying to take over the whole world, and they just lost a sizable chunk of their landing force. While the squad could have definitely made use of a guy like Captain America, the general refused, saying they needed him elsewhere, and in fact were only going to provide backup to the commandos for another week. If they couldn't get this under control by then, Zardos was on his own. The soldier, knowing just how dire things were, then told the man that he wasn't so sure what good any more men would do them. If they did not make it back from this mission, he pleaded with the general to stop the invasion and get out of Europe as soon as they could. We then see just how bad things had gotten, where he'd witnessed the Crimson grounds where Brookner and his soldiers had taken their victims. Deep underground, we then see that these victims' bodies had been placed in alien-like fleshy cocoons, ready to birth ungodly creations unlike anything the world had seen. Making their way out of the general's tent, the team admitted that things could have gone better, and they absolutely needed someone like Cap on their side. However, they may have just got the next best thing in the form of the eager and murderous young Bucky, who was all too ready to go out and kill some demon Nazis. Zardos would tell the kid to scram, where Romero vouched for him, saying that he had seen the newsreels of Bucky in action, and they could definitely benefit from his aid. The sorcerer would double down on things, saying that he didn't want a dead kid on his conscience, where surprisingly, even Peggy Carter would argue back, saying that Barnes was a highly efficient killer and would be a good addition to the team. The less tan and hairier than usual Nick Fury agreed with Zardos that this would be a bad idea, where the kiddo debated his case, asking just what the worst could happen, as he officially was not even old enough to enlist yet. Oh, and while he was at it, asked Fury if he could bum a smoke. This demented killer enthusiasm seemed to work on the men, where Fury told the kid to hide in the Jeep and made him promise that if he got caught, to tell Cap he stowed away. Man, bringing child soldiers into a historical real-world war with sprinkled fictional supernatural elements? Big Boss Snake would be so proud. Zardos would then turn to his teammates, where he would tell them that this was a big mistake, and there will be a cost, and they dare not ask him to pay it when that time comes. Later that night, the squad would come across a demolished town that had been destroyed by enemy forces. Romero still not fully in control of his Ghost Rider transformation, would know something was wrong, where he was able to immediately turn into his alter ego, saying that something was close. On guard, the team investigated, with Bucky saying the quietness of things like this always made him nervous. Peggy would tell him to sing a song to calm his nerves, where the boy would then tell her he didn't know any songs. Buck did say he memorized the cadence calls they would make him run to, and he could sing one of those, where Zardos kindly asked him not to. Wolverine would soon catch something was amiss, where he and Ghost Rider both would be able to sense some sort of disturbance underground. Instantly, the earth would erupt, where a giant screeching behemoth would emerge, where the heroes would go to retreat to safety. Wondering just what the heck this was, Zardos would inform the troops that this was another unhallowed, except this one was a giant flesh crab spider monster made out of the literal bodies of thousands of victims. Projecting a force field to keep the monster at bay, he told the team to get to cover, where Logan, despite having a giant blade sticking out of his stomach, said there was no way he was backing out of this fight, where he then leapt at the beast Kratos style and began to slice into the corpses within. Bucky would think this was absolutely awesome, where he'd begin to laugh hysterically as the others opened fire. Man, I love this sadistic young version of Barnes. He almost makes Jason Todd look normal by comparison, and that's really saying something. Seeing Ghost Rider zip around the creature as he cut into it with his chains, Bucky would then ask the man if he needed a gunner, where he'd then be greeted with a pretty sick next series of panels where the pair would ride towards the demon as the kid would let loose and start singing his cadence calls he mentioned from before. Riding his bike at superhuman speeds, Romero would launch he and the boy into the sky, where they would rain literal hot-leaded hell into the monster from the skies above.